Hannah Bloom woke up every day before the sun. Her hands, already marked by the cold dawns and damp petals, touched the flowers with an almost sacred care. She wasn't just a florist, she was an artist of simplicity. Her shop, Roots and Petals, was small, but filled with meaning. The wooden shelves carried more than just arrangements. They carried memories, goodbyes, and new beginnings. And despite the tight bills and daily challenges, Hannah never stopped smiling at anyone who walked through her door. It was as if her soul bloomed among the lilies, even when the world around her felt dry. That day, the shop's usual calm was interrupted by something unexpected. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the dusty window. It was a car that didn't belong on that modest street or near that peeling facade. Two men in suits stepped out and walked briskly to the door, making way for an elegant woman with an impatient expression. She didn't ask permission. She simply entered, glanced around with a critical eye, and said, "It's simple, but authentic. Maybe it'll work." Hannah raised an eyebrow, not understanding what was happening. That's when she heard the proposal that would change everything. The woman, secretary for a luxury events company, explained coldly, "We need a rustic arrangement, something different. The groom saw a travel magazine article about your shop. He wants something real. You have 3 days to prepare the floral decor for Blake Lancaster's engagement party." The name made Hannah freeze inside. Blake Lancaster, the name, plastered across business magazines, tabloids, and scandal headlines. Heir to the Lancaster Group, about to marry Elizabeth Sterling, daughter of a senator. A couple built on appearances, political deals, and silent contracts. But why her? Hannah hesitated. She wanted to say no, to refuse the invitation to step into a world she never belonged to. But the payment offered could cover her overdue rent, restock her supplies, and keep the little community garden she maintained behind the store alive. She took a deep breath, tied her hair into a messy bun, and replied calmly, "Real flowers tell real stories. If that's what he wants, he'll have it." The woman rolled her eyes and left without saying thank you. And just like that, without even realizing, Hannah had agreed to bloom through concrete. The engagement day arrived before she could prepare emotionally. The event was set on a rooftop garden atop a luxury building in Manhattan. Hannah arrived in her old truck, loaded with sunflowers, lavender, and eucalyptus. As she stepped out of the service elevator, she felt the judging stares of the event staff. But she stood her ground, just like she did when tending roots. "I'm a florist, not a magazine cover designer," she thought as she arranged the flowers with steady hands and an open heart. She was finishing the final arch of wildflowers. A sudden hush fell over the space. She turned slowly, and there he was, Blake Lancaster, tailored navy suit, commanding posture, and eyes that hid more than they revealed. He didn't look like a love-struck groom. He looked bored, or maybe uncomfortable in his own skin. He walked over slowly, as if unsure what to do. Then, looking at the arrangements, he murmured, almost surprised, "This doesn't look like my world." Hannah stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and met his gaze firmly. "Maybe because you're used to flowers that have no scent, only appearance." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Blake raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being contradicted. But instead of being annoyed, he gave a small, sideways smile. "You speak as if you know me." She held his gaze without flinching. "I don't, but I can spot something fake from a mile away." Then she turned back to her work, leaving him there, facing a woman who didn't bow to power. That brief exchange left something lingering in the air. Blake couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something both unsettling and captivating about Hannah. She didn't flatter him, didn't stumble over her words, and didn't seem even slightly impressed by his presence. It was as if she'd lived too much to be shaken by expensive suits. Watching her fix a bouquet with almost maternal tenderness, Blake felt something tug at his chest. A memory of his mother's garden, of her hands covered in earth and love. He closed his eyes for a second, and came back with a lump in his throat. The height of the ceremony, as elite guests arrived in high heels and rehearsed smiles. Hannah was quietly slipping away, but before she could reach the service elevator, a guard stopped her. "The groom requested you stay until the end," he said without question. Surprised, Hannah agreed. She stood in a corner, observing the scene she had helped build. It was a dazzling party, but artificial. Real flowers in a room full of plastic emotions. Blake scanned the crowd, searching. He was tired of handshakes, hollow compliments, and futures he hadn't chosen. When his eyes finally found Hannah, standing alone with a flower in her hair, he walked toward her as if the rest of the world had disappeared. "Aren't you supposed to be backstage?" he teased. "Aren't you supposed to be in love?" she replied. The silence that followed said more than words ever could. In that moment, they both knew they were trapped in roles they never wrote. Elizabeth, Sterling's gaze sliced through them like a knife. She approached, gripping Blake's arm tightly. "Ready for the toast?" she asked, smiling with her teeth, but not with her eyes. Blake nodded, but his eyes were still on Hannah. The florist looked away and started walking toward the exit. This wasn't her place. It never had been. But before she reached the door, she heard a low voice behind her. "Would you deliver flowers at my wedding too?" Hannah paused, but didn't turn around. She simply replied, "Depends on the bride." That night, Hannah arrived home with her hands still smelling of lavender. But it was Blake's eyes that wouldn't leave her mind. Eyes of someone carrying the world, but with no place to rest. She grabbed one of the leftover cards from the event and wrote without thinking. "Flowers say what you're too afraid to. Learn to listen." She placed the note in a glass vase where roses once bloomed. Because, for some reason she didn't yet understand, it didn't feel like the story had ended. Meanwhile, atop one of the most guarded buildings in New York, Blake ignored the camera flashes and his father's reprimands for talking too much to the florist. He poured himself a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony. The city sparkled below, but it all felt hollow. In his hand, he held a small flower left behind on a linen napkin. He smirked, almost ironically, and thought, "She has no idea what kind of trouble she's about to become." And for the first time in years, boredom was replaced by something new. Curiosity. News that a nobody florist had decorated the heir's engagement spread fast, like venomous whispers through high society. Some claimed it was a PR stunt to humanize Blake's image. Others said he insisted on it himself. Hannah, however, ignored the rumors. She threw herself into work, trying to silence the growing restlessness inside her. But not even the most delicate flowers could quiet the memory of that look, as if he'd seen something in her. And she, in him. 3 days later, as she was rearranging pots in the backyard garden, she heard tires crunch on gravel outside the shop. A black car. Again. But this time, it wasn't bodyguards, it was him. Blake stepped out alone, no suit, wearing jeans and a rolled-up shirt. He looked out of place among the clay pots and wooden benches, and yet, perfectly whole. Hannah stood, surprised but steady. "If you came for flowers, you'll have to wait in line," she said with a half-smile. He simply replied, "Actually, I came for answers." "Answers to what?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Blake studied her for a few seconds before speaking. How someone who's lived so little can make so much sense. The line, spoken with disarming sincerity, caught Hannah off guard. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment, a provocation, or a trap. But in that moment, she felt she was facing someone who, even surrounded by millions, was still searching for something money couldn't buy. "Maybe because I've learned to listen to things that don't scream," she said. And he smiled. The conversation continued among the flowers. No pomp, no rush. Blake shared how his mother used to plant lavender when she needed to think, that it was the only scent that brought him peace. Hannah listened in silence, honoring the space between words. When he finished, she handed him a small bundle of lavender wrapped in brown paper. "Sometimes, what you're looking for already has a scent. You just have to stop running from it." Blake took the bundle carefully, as if it were too fragile for his world. And for a moment, he looked like an ordinary man. Before leaving, he glanced around. Everything was simple, but alive. "Real. Have you ever thought about leaving this place?" he asked. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Have you ever thought about staying?" The answer was a silence heavy with meaning. He nodded softly, then walked to the car. As he got in, he looked back through the rearview mirror. Hannah was still there, standing among the flowers, arms crossed, hair loosely tied. And for the first time, Blake Lancaster felt that maybe you didn't need an empire to feel at home. The next day, Hannah received an envelope sealed with the Lancaster Group insignia. Inside was an unexpected invitation. Official hiring for the Blooming Hearts Gala. Exclusive floral design requested by Mr. Blake Lancaster. She held the paper with trembling hands. Not because of the proposal itself, but because of who had sent it. The florist who once only wanted to survive had just stepped into the most dangerous garden in the city, the world of appearances, and maybe of hidden truths too. The Blooming Hearts Foundation was the social jewel of the Lancaster Group, created in memory of Blake's mother, but over time, it had become a political showcase. The annual gala raised millions, yet real change in the communities mentioned in reports was hard to find. Blake knew that, and even though his father wanted to keep up appearances, Blake was determined to do things differently that year. Choosing a simple florist from a small town was already his first act of rebellion. The problem was, in his world, rebellion was treated as betrayal. Hannah arrived at the foundation with steady hands but a restless heart. The golden halls, marble columns, polished faces, everything screamed that she didn't belong. And yet, something in her resisted. like flowers blooming through cracked pavement. She wore a simple blue jumpsuit, neat and clean. She carried a basket with arrangement samples and a notebook filled with sketches. When she was announced at the reception, the staff member hesitated, as if doubting the name. "Hannah Bloom, are you sure you're at the right event?" She replied with a smile that cut like a blade. "I am. Are you?" The woman blushed, then let her in. As Hannah walked down the corridors, she felt the stares follow her, some curious, others contemptuous. She ignored them, focused on what she came to do: create beauty where few could see meaning. She was led to a room where Blake was waiting. He looked different from that first time. No social armor, no rush. When he saw her, he gave a brief but genuine smile. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. She dropped the basket on the table. "I didn't think you were used to people not giving up." Blake looked at the flowers as if reading a letter. He gently touched a dahlia, as if confessing something. "These were my mother's favorites." Hannah nodded. She must have been someone who didn't let herself be silenced. He looked at her, surprised. "You read about her?" "No, I listen to what the flowers tell me." And there, among flowers, confessions, and silences that spoke louder than words, the two began weaving an invisible thread that connected their scars. A delicate thread, but increasingly hard to ignore. While the decor was being assembled, they crossed paths often. Blake kept finding excuses to appear in the hall. He followed every detail closely, as if trying to decipher more than the arrangements, as if trying to decipher her. Hannah remained professional, but her breath always shifted slightly when he got close. There was a tension in the air, unspoken, unacknowledged, but very present, like a fragrance you smell before you know where it's coming from. Elizabeth Sterling, however, sensed the shift. She watched from afar, eyes sharp and a smile too polished to be sincere. She was beautiful, eloquent, and the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the country. But everything about her felt calculated, like each gesture was rehearsed for cameras and contracts. Seeing Blake smile toward the florist, her lips curved into a silent warning. She approached Hannah with theatrical grace, extending a hand. "Thank you for taking the challenge. It's so charming to see simple people getting their moment." Hannah shook her hand firmly. Charming indeed, especially when someone thinks giving a chance is a favor, not a right. Elizabeth's smile faltered for a second, but quickly recovered. "You're clever," she said. "I'm fair," Hannah replied. And in that brief exchange of polite words and sharp intentions, it became clear: not all battles are fought in shouts. Some are fought with elegance. And both women knew the war had begun. That night, back home, Hannah found a box at her shop's door. Inside, white lilies and a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me what matters. B." She held the note as if it were fragile. She didn't know exactly what Blake wanted, but she knew he didn't see her like the others did. And that was the start of something dangerous. Because what begins with flowers sometimes ends in thorns. Still, she slipped the note into a book and smiled. Meanwhile, Blake sat in his office with the lights off. On the wall, a photo of his mother smiling in a lavender field. He touched the frame with his fingers. "She would have liked you, Hannah," he murmured. But the next thought was bitter. "My father never will." Because in Blake's world, personal choices were negotiated like stocks. And love, if it even existed, was considered a liability. But maybe, for the first time, he was willing to invest in something he couldn't control. Days later, an article hit the press. The elite's florist, high society's new darling. With discreet photos from the event and subtle suggestions about Blake's constant presence near the decorator. Hannah was furious. She never wanted fame, never chased spotlights. But now, her name was out there. And with it, her vulnerability. She stormed into the foundation demanding answers, and ran right into Blake mid-meeting with the board. She entered without being announced. "If this is a PR stunt, I'm out." Blake immediately stood and asked for a moment alone. He led Hannah to a side room and shut the door. "I swear I didn't authorize that article. They're trying to create a narrative to push me out of the foundation's presidency." Hannah stared at him, eyes burning with hurt and anger. "I'm not a piece on your chessboard, Blake. I have my own story, my own boundaries." He nodded, sincerely. "I know. That's why you're the only real thing in this fake world." The silence between them was heavier now, and more intimate. Hannah stepped back. She needed to think, to breathe. But as she walked out of the foundation, something inside her had already shifted. Because even if she denied it, even if she resisted, she felt it. And so did Blake. What was growing between them wasn't a game. It was a seed. And seeds, when well tended, can break through even the hardest concrete. The question was, would there be space to bloom in his world? The next morning, Hannah found her shop window vandalized. "Gold Digger" written in red paint. Her heart pounded, not because of the word, but because it embodied everything she had always fought against. Being judged without being heard. Being placed in boxes where she didn't belong. She cleaned each letter herself, in silence, as if refusing to let someone else's filth stick to her skin. Then, with her usual calm, she placed a lavender vase in its place. Because where there is pain, she chose to plant resilience. Blake heard about the attack from an employee and showed up at the shop by the end of the day. No security, no mask. When he saw the wall still damp from being scrubbed, he stopped, unsure of what to say. Hannah came from the back, tired, but steady. Didn't think you'd show. He looked at her, like someone searching for excuses in her eyes. I should have come sooner. She nodded. But you came. And that already changes a lot. For the first time, he didn't try to play the untouchable man. He was there, stripped of certainty. And she didn't turn him away. Tell me what to do to fix this, he asked, voice low. Hannah sighed. You don't fix what the world chooses to twist. But you can choose where to stand. Blake stepped closer, stopping just a breath away. I want to stand with you. The words lingered in the air like a half-opened flower. Hannah didn't answer right away. She simply handed him a small bouquet she'd just arranged. Then hold this, and be ready for the consequences. It was a bouquet of white carnations, the symbol of courage and truth. That same evening, as they walked together toward the backyard garden, Blake shared something he'd never told anyone. About the night his mother died. About what he heard, and didn't say. Hannah listened, without interrupting, without rushing. She simply offered presence. And when he looked away, ashamed of his own vulnerability, she gently touched his hand. You're not weak for feeling, Blake. You're strong for not running from it. And in that quiet touch, he felt more truth than in years of speeches and galas. She walked him to his car, and before getting in, he took one last look at the shop's facade. The traces of vandalism were still there, but now mixed with flowers. Your world is small, but it feels bigger than mine. Hannah gave a soft, sideways smile. Because love doesn't need square footage, Blake. It needs room inside. And when he drove away, something had shifted between them. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. As if, in the middle of the chaos, they had each finally found what the other was trying to hide. That night, Blake canceled every meeting for the week. He sat by the fireplace in his quiet mansion and opened one of his mother's old journals. Between the pages, he found a handwritten note. The rarest beauty grows where no one's looking. And sometimes, it's the one that teaches us how to live. Next to the line, there was a dried flower, a white carnation. And for the first time in years, Blake Lancaster cried. Not because of loss, but because of possibility. The days that followed felt like a pause between storms. Hannah tried to keep up her routine, pretending nothing had changed, but something had. Blake had begun to show up in small, quiet ways. A flower left with no cinder, a basket of teas. At her door, a handwritten note that read, I still hear your silence. She didn't reply, but smiled to herself among the vases. Something inside her, long dormant, had begun to bloom with unexpected strength. And at the same time, the memory of the vandalism remained, a reminder that the world rarely forgives when someone simple gets too close to power. Meanwhile, Blake tried to keep his life in order between meetings, reports, and the invisible weight of a choice he hadn't yet had the courage to make. His engagement to Elizabeth was still officially intact, but between them, it was all for show. She knew, he knew, but there were political alliances, family contracts, reputations to uphold. Elizabeth, ever composed, would never lose her poise. But behind her smile, her eyes accused. She watched him with the calculated patience of someone waiting for the perfect time to strike. And Blake knew, the Cold War had begun. The Blooming Hearts Foundation was planning a press event to announce a new international partnership. Elizabeth insisted Hannah do the floral design again, said it was great for brand image. Blake was suspicious, but Hannah agreed, with one condition: she wanted to speak. She wanted to use the stage to share the community garden project she ran with at-risk youth. Surprised by her courage, Blake promised she'd have her moment. But he knew it wouldn't come without cost. Not for her. Not for him. On the day of the event, the room was packed. Cameras, flashes, influencers, journalists, all waiting for the announcement of the future of the Lancaster legacy. Hannah entered quietly through the back, composed but grounded. She wore a simple moss green dress, her hair tied back with dried flowers. She carried a folder with project photos and a heart pounding faster than she would ever admit. Blake watched her from afar. He felt proud and afraid, because every step she took toward truth brought him closer to the confrontation he had long delayed. When she was called on stage, there was a stir in the audience. Who was this woman with no famous name, no designer label, no pedigree? But as She began to speak about soil, flowers, neglect, and rebuilding. The room fell silent. She didn't use fancy words. She spoke from the soul. She showed pictures of children planting in makeshift pots, told real stories of resilience and presence. And when she finished, she looked straight at Blake standing in the back. If we want to change the world, we have to start close. Sometimes that means listening to a flower. The applause was modest. Some sincere, others just polite. But a spark had been lit. Blake walked to her afterward and discreetly took her hand. "You were amazing," Hannah replied simply. "I didn't come here for you, Blake. I came for the kids." He smiled softly. "I know. That's why you're unlike anyone I've ever met." But the moment was cut short by Elizabeth, who appeared smiling, a photographer in tow. "Couple of the year photo," she suggested. Blake let go of Hannah's hand slowly, and the camera froze something that, deep inside, was already crumbling. The photo of the trio hit the internet the next day. But what truly went viral was an unofficial image. Blake looking at Hannah while holding Elizabeth's hand. The caption read, "He was with one, but looking at another." The comments exploded: scandal, speculation, judgment. Hannah had to unplug her phone. She received threats, insults, but also messages of support. Many said she gave a voice to those who never had a seat at that table. Still, the weight of the spotlight drained her. Every compliment felt like an invitation to conflict. That night, she turned off every light in the shop, lit a single candle in the back room, and sat among the plants. She needed the scent of earth to remember who she was. She felt like she was losing control of her own story. And deep down, a question gnawed at her. How far was it worth going for someone who wasn't even free to choose whom he loved? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Blake, soaked from the rain, eyes red. "I can't do this anymore, Hannah." She hesitated for a second, then opened the door all the way. He entered without a word, just sat on the floor beside her. They remained silent for minutes, listening to the rain on the tin roof. Then Blake spoke, almost in a whisper. "My mother used to say that true love is the kind that sets us free. And everything I've lived so far has only trapped me." Hannah rested her head on his shoulder. She didn't promise anything, didn't speak sweet words, but she stayed. And in that shared silence, something was stitched between them, something no headline could ever explain. In the days that followed, they began seeing each other more often. In secret, in her garden, on walks through quiet streets, in little cafes where no one recognized them. It was there, away from the flashes, that their truth began to bloom. Blake spoke of the fears his father had planted. The fear of failure, of dishonor, of never being enough. Hannah listened, held his hand, and told him, "You are not your legacy. You are what you choose to plant, and what you're brave enough to harvest." But time didn't stop, and the pressure grew. Elizabeth took action. She called the press to officially announce the wedding date. On national television, she said she was thrilled to unite two great families through love and shared values. Blake watched in silence, then turned off the TV and told Hannah, "I can't pretend anymore. I have to choose." She cupped his face in her hands. "Then choose with your heart, even if it hurts, even if it costs everything." And he knew that moment was coming. The next morning, Blake called a press conference. He didn't inform his father or the board. He was done. He wore a simple suit, no tie, and stepped onto the stage with a racing heart. As the lights came on and microphones crowded in, he took a deep breath and began. "For a long time, I lived the life others expected of me. I followed a script written by everyone but me." Cameras rolled, eyes froze, and in the back, Elizabeth watched with clenched fists. "But there is no true legacy without truth. And the truth is, I can't keep living under a name if it means abandoning my soul." The murmurs rose. Journalists exchanged glances. Blake continued, "The Blooming Hearts Foundation will undergo a real transformation, focused on those who need help, not those who pose for magazine covers." His words hit like thunder, but he wasn't done. "And as for my personal life, I've made a decision." The flashes intensified, but he just smiled softly and said, "I choose truth, even if she wears flowers in her hair." Hours later, Hannah was still in the shop, unaware of what had happened. She'd turned off her phone, avoided social media, hidden from the chaos. All she wanted was to protect her peace and her heart. Then she heard cars stopping outside. Voices. "Hey, crowd." When she opened the door, she saw a group of reporters holding cameras and microphones. And in the middle of them, Blake, standing tall, eyes steady, holding a bouquet of white carnations. "Hannah Bloom," he said aloud, "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to honor you." She stood still, the cameras pointed at her, the world watching. And he, standing there, continued, "I could have hidden. I could have followed the same old script. but knowing you taught me that living honestly takes courage." Then he knelt, one knee to the ground, the bouquet trembling in his hands. "I have no empty promises, only the truth of what I feel, and it begins when I'm with you." Silence swept the street, and in Hannah's chest, a quiet revolution began. She walked slowly toward him. The cameras captured every detail, but she saw only his eyes. When she reached him, she held his face in both hands and said, "The truth is, I choose you too, even afraid, even with no guarantees." The kiss that followed was simple, but so full of truth, no headline could ever describe it. It was the end of a long wait and the beginning of something no one, not even fate, could control. The image of the two spread across the country in minutes. The heir who knelt before the florist made headlines, flooded social media, and sparked debate. Some applauded, others criticized, but most were moved. Because deep down, everyone dreams of a love that breaks the rules. A love that chooses, even when the world says not to. And so, between simple flowers and monumental choices, Hannah and Blake stopped being opposites and became home for each other. Behind the scenes, Blake's father erupted, cut funding, threatened to strip him of his leadership, demanded a public apology. But Blake didn't budge. "I've already lost too much trying not to lose the rest," he said. "Now, if I have to lose something, let it be for being who I am." And for the first time, the empire shook, not because of money, but because of courage. Hannah, at his side, stood firm, like the roots of flowers that grow even where no one believes they can. Elizabeth, on the other hand, disappeared from the spotlight. Rumors of a new political alliance surfaced, but she never addressed the broken engagement. Hannah knew her silence wouldn't last forever. This wasn't over. But for now, she chose to live one day at a time. To care for her flowers, teach the kids in the community garden, and love Blake the way he needed, without demands, without roles, just with presence. Blake, now free from boardrooms and suits, started showing up at the shop almost daily. He helped carry boxes, water plants, listen to stories. The hands that once signed contracts now also cleaned vases. And in his eyes, a new light had emerged. Not the shine of success, but the glow of someone who had finally found fertile ground to exist. And beside Hannah, he learned that real power is blooming where no one expects. In the final scene of that chapter in their lives, the two sat on the shop steps at sunset. Hannah leaned against Blake's shoulder, bare feet on the sidewalk. Around them, flower pots, children laughing, the soft sound of joy. "Do you still feel afraid?" she asked. He smiled, gazing at the golden sky. "Yes, but now, it's the kind of fear that comes with something real to lose." She nodded, holding his hand. Because when love has roots, it doesn't break with the wind. It stays and changes everything. What should have been the beginning of a new chapter for Hannah and Blake turned into a minefield. His gesture, kneeling before a florist, became headline, poetry, and provocation. On social media, the couple became a symbol of true love to some and unforgivable defiance to others. The elite world Blake came from didn't forgive rebellion, and that knee on the ground was seen as betrayal. His father, enraged, called emergency meetings. Advisors demanded he back down. But Blake, now steadier than ever, said only one thing: "I won't go back." Meanwhile, Hannah lived with watchful eyes around her. Strange customers started visiting the shop just to stare in silence. Harsh comments flooded her profile, and whispers circled town. She trapped him. She's ambitious. She's going to destroy the empire. But Hannah didn't bow. She kept her hands in the soil, tended her flowers, and welcomed the youth from the project as always. To her, the root of resistance was to keep going, especially when the world expected her to give up. The Blooming Hearts Foundation, now under new leadership, began truly investing in community work. Hannah led the social projects, with Blake at her side, funding every initiative with his own resources. But it didn't take long for sabotage to appear. One event was canceled over forged irregularities. Documents disappeared. Sensationalist articles began circulating. And behind it all, Elizabeth. She didn't show her face, but she was everywhere, in boardrooms, in press offices, in quiet, calculated alliances. Then, on a rainy afternoon, the first bomb dropped. A lawsuit was filed against Hannah, accusing her of misusing foundation funds. The evidence was weak, but enough to spark scandal. Blake rushed to the shop in tears. "They're trying to destroy you because they can't control me anymore." Hannah, eyes steady, replied, "Then let's show them that truth has roots." That day, the two made a promise, not just to protect each other, but to protect something bigger, the possibility of a different world. With the help of an independent lawyer, they built their case, gathered testimonies, photos, records. Young people impacted by the project spoke out in support of the florist. "She changed my life," said a 15-year-old girl. "She taught me how to care for the earth when no one cared for me." The movement grew. Hashtags spread. But even then, the battle was uneven. And a new threat was coming. Not legal. Personal. An anonymous letter arrived at the shop. Addressed to Hannah. Inside, only one sentence cut from a newspaper. "You have no idea who you're messing with." She didn't tell Blake. She didn't want to worry him further. But her silence didn't stop the shadow from creeping in. At night, she dreamed of doors slamming shut. Woke up with a jolt. Slept with the light on. Still she pressed on. Like the flowers that insist on blooming under storms. Blake, meanwhile, was drowning in exhausting meetings trying to keep the foundation from collapsing. His father, cold and calculating, made him an offer. Blake could keep control if he broke up with Hannah publicly. "You must understand, son, some loves cost the entire empire." Blake looked him in the eye, then let the empire burn. "But not what I feel." The words landed like a blow. And for the first time, his father looked at him with something close to respect. Or fear. That same night, Blake showed up at the shop with an envelope. "This could help us." Inside were old email copies between Elizabeth and board members, revealing manipulation and past misconduct. "It's evidence. But if we use it, we expose her completely." Hannah read the papers carefully, then looked at him and said, "Truth doesn't have to be revenge. It can be justice." So they chose not to expose everything. Only what was needed. Because the strongest root isn't the one that destroys. It's the one that holds firm when the ground shakes. But Elizabeth could feel her grip slipping. And when the scandal faded and Hannah was cleared of all charges, she acted with her signature chill. She scheduled a dinner with the press. And on national television, delivered a subtle attack. "I wish Blake and Hannah all the happiness. May they be a shining example of how even the most delicate flowers can hide dangerous thorns." The poison was there. Elegant. Calculated. And the public, once again divided, began to see Hannah not as a victim, but as a threat. In the days that followed, the attacks returned. Not in paint this time, but in stares. Customers came only to observe. Phone calls rang in the middle of the night with no answer. Hannah tried to stay strong, but something inside her started to crack. It wasn't fear of what people said. It was the feeling of being swallowed by a world that was never hers. Blake tried to shield her, but even the strongest love sometimes needs silence to survive. And the silences between them were growing. One evening, after another tense fight with his family's lawyers, Blake walked into the shop and found Hannah lying among the flower pots, staring at the glass ceiling where rain fell softly. He sat beside her in silence. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "I'm not afraid of what they say about me, Blake. I'm afraid of becoming someone I'm not, just to fit into your world." He held her hand. "And if my world doesn't exist anymore, we'll build a new one." But not everything could be fixed with promises. The tension between them grew, subtle like cracks after an earthquake. Hannah felt she was no longer just herself, but his woman. And that hurt, because she'd always been more than a name tied to someone else. Blake, on the other hand, struggled to balance his love with the war he was fighting. But the battlefield was unfair. And even the strongest love began hiding behind excuses. Less time, more absences, and a distance that, slowly, left scars. Then came the inevitable. A famous brand offered Hannah a contract. They wanted her as a symbol of authenticity. Photos, commercials, interviews. It was her chance to speak, but also the risk of losing her essence. When she told Blake, he said nothing, just nodded. If it's what you want, but she felt it. For the first time, he doubted whether they were still walking in the same direction. And that shook her, not because of the offer, but because of the space growing between them. That night, Hannah wrote a letter, not to end things, but to remember. She spoke about the first flowers, the white carnation, the day he knelt, not for love, but for truth. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in an envelope with dried lavender, and left it in the foundation office. Blake read it in silence. At the bottom of the page, one line stood out. "Don't ask me to fit into a vase that's already full of old roots." And he knew. It wasn't goodbye, but it was a warning. Meanwhile, a new report was about to break. Elizabeth had leaked a dossier with photos from Hannah's past, her father's prison sentence, her humble teenage years, her mother's debts. "Does the Lancaster heir really know his florist story?" read the headline. When Blake saw the article in advance, his blood ran cold. Not because of the truth in it, but because of how it was being weaponized. He knew he had to act fast, before the world forgot what mattered most. That Hannah's past was what made her admirable. Without hesitation, Blake called a live interview. But this time, not to defend himself, only to speak the truth. He stepped onto the stage, took a deep breath, and said, "The woman beside me built everything with her own hands. With wounded roots, yes, but with flowers no one else dared to plant. And if the world prefers to judge rather than understand, then judge me. Because it's our silence that has always silenced people like her." Hannah watched from the shop, eyes filled with tears. And for the first time, she felt truly seen. The next morning, an envelope appeared under the shop door. No name, no return address, just a photograph. In it, Hannah and Blake laughing together in the community garden, surrounded by children. On the back, a handwritten line. "Truth disturbs because it blooms where no one planted." She held the photo with trembling hands. Outside, the world remained the same. But inside her, something began to bloom again. Because now she knew, the pain of belonging to yourself is always less than the pain of losing yourself in a world that was never yours. The chapter ends with Blake standing outside the closed shop at night. He holds her letter, the photo, and a small box. When Hannah opens the door, he simply says, "I'm not here to ask you for anything, just to show you something." Inside the box, a simple ring with a flower carved in silver. "If one day you want to build a garden from scratch with me, this will be our beginning." Hannah doesn't respond. She just smiles with her eyes and says, "As long as it's a garden where I can grow freely." Because the kind of love that remains is the one that honors even the space between the roots. Summer arrived shyly in the city, with long days and nights where the breeze floated gently through the shop's windows. Hannah spent more time in the community garden, rearranging pots, planting new seeds. She felt like she was being reborn, slowly but wholly. Blake remained present, though more discreet. After his public interview in her defense, the pressure had eased, but the shadow of the world around them still lingered. Even so, they tried to build a routine, a kind of invisible home where only truth could enter. Until one ordinary morning, the shop bell rang. Hannah, crouched near the chrysanthemums, stood up without rush until she saw who it was. Her smile vanished, her eyes darkened, and her heart, which had endured so many battles, clenched like a child's again. "Hello," Hannah said, the familiar voice, heavy with memories she'd rather have buried. It was Elliot Bloom, her older brother, the one who disappeared years ago, leaving behind debts, lies, and open wounds. The one she had sworn never to forgive. That he looked different. Thinner, with an unshaven face and eyes that had seen too much. But he still wore the same arrogant smile. "I heard about you. The shop. The millionaire. Impressive. Huh?" Hannah swallowed hard. "What do you want?" Elliot shrugged. "Just wanted to see my sister. Family matters." She crossed her arms, keeping her distance. "You only show up when you want something. I have nothing for you." He smirked, colder. "Maybe not. But the world out there might pay well for some old stories, don't you think?" Hannah's blood ran cold. Elliot had always known how to manipulate. He was the one who dragged their father into dealings with loan sharks. The one who sold false promises while she picked up the pieces. And now he was here, threatening to reopen wounds in exchange for money. She walked to the door and opened it slowly. "You have 3 minutes to leave. After that, I call the police." He didn't move at first, but finally walked past her with a twisted grin. Before leaving, he muttered, "You may have become a flower, Hannah, but I know your roots." All day, Hannah tried to pretend nothing had happened. She returned to the garden, helped customers, smiled at children. But inside, she was crumbling. That night, Blake showed up with fresh bread and 2 coffees, like he did every week. He found her quiet, eyes low, hands restless. "Something happened?" he asked, sitting beside her. She hesitated for a long time, then decided to tell him. Everything. About Elliot. About the past. About the shame that still whispered in her bones. "I know you protect me, Blake, but there are things even love can't clean." He listened in silence, then took her hand. "I don't love you despite your past. I love you also because of it." Hannah cried, unable to respond. But the fear lingered, because she knew who Elliot was, and what he was capable of. "He's going to try to sell my story. Twist everything." Blake leaned closer. "Then let's tell it first. Truthfully. In our own way." But she knew, not every story could be controlled. And sometimes, someone else's version of the truth becomes your prison. 2 days later, her fears came true. A tabloid blog published a headline. "The florist who charmed a millionaire, but hides a criminal past in the family." Old photos, court records, clipped phrases. It was an attack. And even with the foundation's support and Blake's official statement defending her, the damage was done. Hannah was once again labeled an opportunist, a risk to the company's image. The hateful comments returned. And this time, even the youth project took a hit. Blake tried to shield her. He increased security, brought in new staff, withdrew from some public events. But now, meetings with investors came with clear clauses, reputation matters. And for the first time, he hesitated. Not with words, but with actions. He began avoiding being seen publicly with her. Canceled a joint interview. Missed a garden delivery. And Hannah, who had always known how to read silences, understood. As much as he loved her, he still didn't know how to hold on. When the world told him to let go, one night, she confronted him. "Do you still love me, Blake?" He took a while to respond. "More than anything." She nodded. "Then why do I feel like I'm standing here alone?" He lowered his eyes. "Because I'm trying to save everything at once. And I don't know if I can." Hannah smiled painfully. "You don't have to save me. You just have to be here." But in that moment, Blake was already far away, trapped between the man he wanted to be and the man the world demanded. That night, Hannah went to the garden at the foundation. She sat alone under the greenhouse. The air smelled like wet soil and silence. She wrote in an old notebook the words she didn't dare say aloud. "If I ever leave, it's not because I stopped loving you. It's because I needed to love myself again." She closed the notebook, looked at the small sprouts growing slowly, and understood true love also needs space. Because when roots begin to suffocate, even the most beautiful flower can't breathe. Blake, that same night, opened the box with the ring he'd saved for the right moment. But now, everything felt uncertain. He felt weak, torn, afraid of losing her, but also afraid of dragging her with him into a world of pressure, contracts, and judgment. He remembered what his mother always said when he hesitated. True love requires presence, not perfection. And he understood. He had to choose. Not just Hannah, but the courage to stand by her through everything, or let her go. The next morning, he arrived at the shop and found the door closed. A note pinned to the wood, written in gentle handwriting. "Closed until further notice. Flowers need rest to bloom again." Blake pressed his forehead to the door, and he knew he was alone. And maybe it was too late. The garden where he had once found peace, now, was silent, and the love, though still alive, had returned to the soil, waiting for a new spring. The days that followed were hollow. Blake wandered between empty meetings and echoing hallways. The foundation kept running, the contract still stood, but everything felt meaningless. He answered emails with short sentences, postponed decisions, skipped events. But the real ache came from the absence inside him. No more flowers delivered to the shop. No more brown paper notes. No more scent of lavender in the air. Only a silence louder than any scandal he'd ever faced. Hannah, meanwhile, withdrew. She left the garden in the care of volunteers and took some time for herself. She went to a neighboring town where no one knew her, rented a small room overlooking a field, spent her afternoons reading, writing, walking barefoot in the grass. She needed to remember who she was before it all, before the fame, before the scandal, before Blake. And deep down, she knew this wasn't running away, it was survival. Because sometimes, to save a love, you must first save yourself. But the silence between them wasn't indifference. It was waiting. It was space. It was a longing that didn't yet know how to speak. Every day, Blake looked at his phone and typed messages he never sent. "Do you still miss me? I bought new lavender seeds. Your place at the shop is still here." But he erased them before pressing send. Because he knew words weren't enough. What she needed now was action, presence, truth. And he was still learning how to become that man. Meanwhile, the world moved on. The scandal faded. The media found new targets. Even Elizabeth stopped being mentioned. But for Blake, everything still revolved around one name. Hannah. Every flower he saw reminded him of her. Every spontaneous smile, every child laughing, every small act of kindness. Because she had left traces everywhere. Not the kind that stain, the kind that transform. And now, he understood. To love her was to accept that he couldn't own her. Only care if she still wanted him close. Then, on a cloudy afternoon, Blake showed up at the community garden. He didn't tell anyone. He just arrived with a toolbox, gloves, and seeds in hand. Young people were watering flower beds. An old woman was pruning shrubs. And among them, he simply knelt down and started digging. With his own hands. No photographers. No speech. He stayed for hours, in silence. Planting, cleaning, watering. Maybe to show something. Maybe to ask forgiveness, in the only way he knew how. On the other side of town, Hannah received a photo from one of the volunteers. It was Blake, kneeling in the garden, his hands covered in dirt. She zoomed in with her fingers and stared for a few long moments. Her heart beat faster, but it wasn't time to run to him. It was time to breathe deeply and understand what that gesture meant. Because sometimes, loving also means knowing how to wait. And forgiveness can't be forced, it must be planted and watered with consistency. That night, back in the simple room she had rented, Hannah opened her journal. She wrote, "He's coming back. Not with words, with actions. And maybe that's a better beginning than any promise." Then she closed the notebook, opened the window, and let the wind touch her face. And for the first time in days, she smiled with her eyes. Because true love never really gets lost. It simply retreats, like the earth before spring. The community garden kept blooming, even on cloudy days. There was something symbolic about that place. Flowers kept growing, even when the sky seemed tired. And on that early week, between new seeds and caring hands, Blake returned. Quietly, without saying when he'd come or when he'd leave. He just showed up, grabbed a hoe, took off his shoes, and spent hours working the soil. The young people watched him in silence. Some thought it was strange to see a millionaire digging. Others just accepted it, as if they could feel. Here, he was just another soul in the rented room. Hannah watched everything from a distance. She received photos, messages from volunteers, spontaneous stories. She didn't ask questions, didn't comment. But every image of Blake on his knees in the soil made her chest ache in a new way. It wasn't quite longing. It was recognition. Because she knew he was trying. In his own way. Without pressure, without grand gestures. Just staying. And deep down she wanted to stay too. But she had to be sure they wouldn't become prisoners of the world's expectations again. It was on a warm afternoon, with a scent of spring, that she returned. She arrived quietly, in a simple dress and her hair pinned to the side. As soon as she stepped into the garden, the young ones ran to embrace her. Laughter, flowers handed to her, sweet words. And then, in the middle of it all, she saw him. Blake, sweaty, in a worn-out t-shirt, hands dirty and eyes fixed on her. He didn't smile. He didn't run. He just looked at her like someone who'd found home. And she returned the gaze with the same silent intensity. Because between them, explanations were no longer needed. The following days were filled with routine. Hannah resumed guiding the group, watering flowers, trimming stems. And Blake remained, without invading, without taking over. His presence was an invitation, not a demand. Sometimes they exchanged a few words. Other times they just shared the silence. But in those silences, there was more truth than in any speech. It was as if they had learned that love isn't about proving. It's about being. Even when everything tries to pull out your roots. One afternoon, Blake arrived early and found Hannah preparing lavender seedlings. He sat beside her without saying a word. After a while, he spoke. "Remember the first time we met? You said real flowers tell real stories." Hannah nodded without looking at him. "Do you still believe that?" he asked. She slowly turned to him and replied, "I do. But some stories need silence before they can bloom again." And Blake understood. She still loved him. But now, with more truth and more care. That same day, he left an envelope on the garden bench. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch, a field with 2 wooden chairs under a tree. And on the back, a note written in firm letters. "Whenever you're ready to come back, the place beside me is already here." Hannah read it in silence, eyes glistening. She tucked the paper into her notebook. And for the first time since everything fell apart, she felt there might still be solid ground between them. The next morning, Hannah packed a basket with cookies, tea, and 2 small pots, one with lavender, the other with sunflower. When she arrived at the garden, she found Blake alone in the sunniest corner. Without saying a word, she sat beside him and offered the basket. They ate in silence, watching the youth from afar. And when they finished, she said, "You're relearning. And that is what touches me the most." He smiled gently. "And you taught me that beauty lies in those who stay, even when the other is lost." Their meetings became routine. Small lunches under the greenhouse, shared watering duties, walks around the garden at dusk. Sometimes they laughed. Other times, they just existed side by side. And in that space, free of demands, love returned. No longer urgent, but mature. Not impulsive, but deep. And everyone noticed. No one called them the media couple anymore. Now they were just Hannah and Blake. A man and a woman, trying again, with more truth. But wounds remained. And one night, when the garden was empty, Hannah said, "You were afraid of losing me, but even more afraid of standing by me." Blake lowered his eyes. "I know, and I still hate myself for that." She touched his hand. "I don't want you to hate yourself. I want you to grow." He took a deep breath. "I'm still scared." She replied, "Then stay. Stay even if you're scared. Because that's what real people do." And in that moment, something inside him cracked. But it was a good kind of breaking, the breaking of pride. That night, Blake didn't go home. He stayed in the garden, sleeping on a wooden bench covered with a blanket Hannah had left behind. He woke up to the sound of children laughing and the smell of fresh bread coming from the community kitchen. For the first time in a long while, he felt light, as if the weight he had carried for years was finally dissolving. Hannah watched him from a distance, a mix of tenderness and respect in her eyes. She knew he still needed time, but she also knew he had already made the most important choice. To stay out on a weekend, they decided to do something symbolic together. Rebuild the old central flower bed in the garden, the one left abandoned since the scandal. They chose flowers that represented resilience, healing, and rebirth. As they dug together under the gentle morning sun, their exchanged glances held more meaning than words. There was ease in their movements, a kind of maturity that only grows after pain. And when they finished, Hannah placed a small wooden sign there. She wrote in firm letters, "Everything that grows in silence blooms stronger." That same afternoon, it rained, but instead of running inside, they stayed there in the garden. Blake took off his shoes. Hannah opened her arms to the sky. They laughed like children, soaked from head to toe. It was as if they weren't just washing their bodies, but also their guilt, their burdens, their fears. And there, in the middle of the rain, Blake hugged her. Tightly, wordlessly. Hannah rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. And in that moment, she understood. He was whole. Not perfect, but whole. And that was more than enough. Later, sitting under the greenhouse, Hannah opened her notebook full of phrases and ideas. She showed Blake a page of sketches and scribbles. "I want to create a permanent space here. A place for listening, art, and care. Not just for the youth, but for anyone carrying invisible pain." Blake read it in silence, then replied softly, "Then let's build it together." And they both smiled. Because now, finally, they were speaking the same language. The language of love that doesn't impose, but builds. A few days later, they announced the new space to the team. Everyone applauded. The name they chose, Living Roots. And within that name was everything they had learned. About time. About pain. About a love that survives even when the world says it's not worth it. The news spread, but this time, not as scandal. As inspiration. The couple who had faced the elite, the rumors, and their own fears were now a symbol of rebuilding. And that, more than fame, was true permanence. One evening, Hannah was making tea in the shop kitchen when Blake walked in silently. He was still in his garden clothes, his hair a mess, his eyes calm. "Can I stay tonight?" he asked. She just nodded, and he stepped closer, gently taking the teapot from her hands. "You taught me that love isn't made of promises, but of constancy." She looked him in the eyes. "And you taught me that even someone afraid can learn to stay." They didn't need to say more. The tea was ready, and the silence between them felt light. That night, lying side by side under the shop's porch, they listened to the crickets, the wind, the sleeping city. Hannah rested her head on his chest and whispered, "If life were made only of moments like this, it'd already be worth it." Blake kissed her forehead and replied, "Then let's live them one by one." It was simple, but it was real. And real love, after so much turmoil, had finally found a place to rest. The following Sunday, they symbolically inaugurated Living Roots. Children pasted posters, young people painted colorful benches, and Hannah gave a small speech. She spoke about fresh starts, about silences that heal, about flowers blooming where no one expects. And when she finished, she called Blake to the little stage. He held her hand and said, "This woman taught me that even silence speaks when it's true. And it's beside her that I want to keep listening." Applause, smiles, and a kiss. Full of silent promises. In the last scene of that chapter, they were sitting together on the garden's new bench, beside the Living Root sign. The sun was setting slowly, painting everything in golden tones. Hannah held a flower between her fingers. Blake, his arm wrapped around her, smiled in silence. And in that moment, there were no more scandals, no more judgment, no past weighing them down. There was only the now, and the now was made of choice, of permanence, and of a love that, even without noise, knew exactly where it belonged. The week after the inauguration, the town felt different to Hannah. Not because the problems were gone, but because now she saw things more clearly. Even the city's noises had a new rhythm. The horns, the chatter, the everyday chaos. It all seemed smaller compared to the peace inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to be accepted. She was simply living. And that was a kind of freedom even the most passionate love had never given her before. Blake had changed too. He smiled with his eyes again. He joined the foundation meetings not out of duty, but with purpose. His public speeches now came with real action. And he mentioned Hannah naturally, not as a symbol or excuse, but as inspiration. He was no longer the heir trying to prove strength. He was a man who had learned that real power is being true to yourself. And Hannah, always attentive, knew this was bigger than any proposal. There were still occasional hurtful comments, a misplaced headline, a veiled remark, a comparison to the past. But neither of them reacted the same way anymore. Because they were rooted, they knew what they had built. And more importantly, they knew what they had overcome within themselves. The ghosts still existed, but they didn't command their steps. And that made everything lighter, more mature, more real. The kind of love that doesn't need to shout, only remain. During a meeting with the youth from the foundation, one boy asked Blake, "Are you afraid of losing everything again?" He stayed quiet for a few seconds, thinking. Then he replied calmly, "Yes. But now, if I lose it all, I'll know exactly what's worth rebuilding." Hannah, seated in the back, felt her heart tighten. Because she knew, rebuilding takes more courage than starting from scratch. And that was exactly what they were doing. Rebuilding, day by day, choice by choice. One ordinary night. As they closed the shop together, Blake stopped at the counter and said, "Do you realize we're building a life without even noticing?" Hannah chuckled softly. "I do. And I love that." He stepped closer, touched her cheek, and whispered, "Maybe one day I'll ask for your hand again. But for now, can I ask for your time?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "Time is the most beautiful thing we have right now." And there, among flowers and the smell of damp earth, they sealed another chapter, with a kiss light as air, but lasting as truth. One morning, a little girl from the garden approached Hannah and said, "You and Blake are like two sunflowers that find each other in the middle of the field." She smiled, enchanted by the image. And she spent the whole day thinking about it. Maybe it was true, each turning to the light, even at different times, but still together. And when she told Blake that night, he replied, "Then let's keep turning, even when the sky is cloudy." Because the love they now lived no longer depended on sunshine. It was made of deep roots. In Hannah's home, there was now a shelf full of keepsakes from their journey. The handwritten note with the first flower arrangement, a photo in the garden, the old, closed until further notice sign. Each item held a story, not a perfect one, but a true one. And every time she felt uncertain, she looked at that little altar of memories and remembered they had survived the judgment, the past, their own flaws. And that was greater than any title or outside approval. At the end of that week, Blake showed up with a simple gift, a small green notebook. "It's for you to write down everything you don't have the courage to say out loud," he explained. Hannah opened it and saw he had left a note on the first page. "Even in silence, I hear you." Those words felt like a hug to the heart, because she knew he would never again try to silence her pain or smother her process. He would just listen, and that meant more than 1,000 declarations. At the close of a workday in the garden, as they put tools away together, Hannah looked at the orange sky and said, "You know what touches me most?" Blake, curious, asked, "What?" She smiled, knowing that all of this started with a flower I arranged in a vase, not knowing it would change our entire lives. He laughed and pulled her close. "The flower was just the beginning. The rest was you." And there, hands dirty with soil and hearts full of love, they ended the day like people who know love born in silence never dies. It only grows. That on a calm Sunday morning, the town was still waking when Hannah opened the shop windows and caught the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Blake was already there, with 2 mugs and a flower tucked into his shirt pocket. "Picked it on the way," he said simply, handing her the mug. Hannah looked at him for a moment and replied, "You're getting good at this." He smiled. "I learned from the best." The coffee was warm, the silence was comforting, and life moved at its own rhythm, not dramatic, but filled with quiet meanings. They spent the day replanting a section of the garden that had been affected by pests. It was slow, patient work, but neither felt rushed, because between old and new roots, they were also rebuilding themselves. Each plant in the soil reshaped a memory. Each watering made old wounds feel lighter. And when they finished, Hannah whispered, "Sometimes, rebuilding something takes more love than starting from scratch." Blake just nodded. He knew she wasn't just talking about flowers. That night, wrapped in blankets on the porch with mugs in their hands, they talked about the future, not in terms of goals, but essence. "I don't want a big house," Hannah said. "I want a place where people feel safe to sit." Blake looked at her with warmth. "And I want to be that place for you. I'm still learning, but I want to try." They didn't make impossible promises. They didn't plan every step. They just dreamed together. And that was more than enough. One day, a child from the project approached Hannah with an envelope. "He asked me to give this to you." It was from Blake, of course. Inside was a piece of recycled paper with a handwritten sentence. "If I could plant only one flower in the whole world, I'd choose you, because you grow even in the hardest soil." Hannah pressed the note to her chest. She didn't reply with words. But that night, she placed a daisy in the pocket of his shirt as he slept on the shop couch. The next morning, Blake found the daisy just as the sun began to filter through the shop's curtains. He smiled, holding the flower as if it were a vow. There were no grand declarations waiting, just breakfast on the counter, a napkin with Hannah's handwriting. The earth is ready for spring. And he knew those words were more than poetic. They were a sign that what had been broken was finally ready to bloom again. Together, without pressa, without fear, just with verdad. The weeks passed. The living root space became more than a garden. It became refuge, testimony, a living metaphor of everything they had lived through. Schools visited the project. Journalists came back, this time, not to dig up the past, but to understand how love and community had transformed what was once just a scandal. Blake and Hannah shared the spotlight with volunteers, neighbors, and children. Because the story was no longer just about the two of them. It belonged to everyone. One afternoon, they received an unexpected visitor, Elizabeth. Dressed with less glitter and more humility, she approached the shop without entourage. Hannah opened the door, surprised. Blake stood beside her. There was tension, but no bitterness. Elizabeth lowered her gaze and said, "I came to apologize. Not for everything. I know it wouldn't be enough. But because, watching you two, I finally understood the kind of love I nunca sobre can heaser." And then she left. No drama, no demand, just a gesture. And it was enough. That night, sitting by candlelight, Hannah said, "Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need a stage, just a little corner to rest." Blake nodded. "Like the love we've built." She looked at him, her voice soft. "It's not perfect." He replied, "No, but it's ours." And in that imperfect love, they found something deeper than passion. They found peace. And peace was everything they never thought they'd find in the middle of so much noise. As spring painted the town in new colors, the shop flourished again. Orders returned, clients multiplied, and even those who once judged now brought flowers home. Hannah no longer felt like she had to prove anything. She simply existed. And that quiet existence was her triumph. Blake, in turn, walked the city with lighter steps. No longer hiding, no longer controlling every headline. He finally understood. The only image worth protecting is the one we see in the eyes of who stays. One Saturday, during a local fair, the foundation set up a stand to sell flower arrangements made by the youth. Hannah guided a group of kids as they arranged tulips and sunflowers. Blake handed out flyers and helped carry crates. They weren't the stars. They were part of something greater. And when a reporter asked for a statement, Hannah simply said, "We're not here to fix the past. We're here to plant a future." The story went viral, not for scandal, but for authenticity. Weeks later, on a calm Sunday morning, Blake woke up earlier than usual. He made tea, placed it on a tray with toast and a flower picked from the garden. When he entered the room, Hannah was already awake, looking out the window. He sat beside her, silently. She leaned on his shoulder, smiling. And then, without needing a perfect moment, he pulled out the old ring box, opened it, and said, "I don't want a big wedding. I just want to keep choosing you, every day. Will you stay?" Hannah didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She just held his face with both hands and whispered, "Yes. As long as there are flowers to be planted, I'll be here." They didn't set a date. They didn't call anyone. They just hugged. And outside, the garden swayed in the wind, as if it, too, said Sim. The story of Hannah and Blake didn't end there. It turned into routine, in shared lunches with the foundation team, in afternoons painting benches, in quiet Sundays on the porch. Their love no longer needed proof. It lived in the glances, in the work gloves, in the coffee always ready on the counter. It was a love that had already lost once and learned how to stay. And if one day you walk by a small shop filled with flowers and laughter and see a man with dirty hands handing tea to a woman with calm eyes, stay a little. Because in that silence lives a love that was once broken, but now blooms every day. Rooted, quiet, eternal. Asterisk, because some loves are not loud. They grow quietly, but when they bloom, they change everything. Summer ended with cooler breezes and mornings where the sky looked like a stretched cotton sheet. In the community garden, new seedlings were adjusting to the changing climate. And among them, Blake and Hannah. The simple routine they had built showed signs of becoming something solid. But as with all true peace, it tends to bother those who thrive on control. It was on an ordinary afternoon that Blake received the call. On the other end, one of the largest international investors, offering him the presidency of a new branch of the holding in London. It was his chance to reclaim the empire. A billionaire proposal, with full freedom and total control. No family impositions. Just him, his vision, and the world at his feet. Blake listened in silence. With each word, it felt like the past was knocking, like an elegant ghost. And at the end of the call came the sentence that left him conflicted. "We know your image has changed, and that's exactly why we want you." As if now that he'd become more human, the world wanted him back, not to transform him, but to use him. Blake walked to the shop without saying a word. He found Hannah arranging a shelf of small vases. She smiled at the sight of him, but in the next instant, her eyes picked up on his silence. "Something happened?" she asked. He hesitated, then told her everything. No embellishment, no excuses. Hannah listened all the way through without interrupting. When he finished, she sat down, took a deep breath, and simply asked, "Do you want to go?" Blake answered honestly, "I don't know." And in that, "I don't know," there was more truth than any yes. The days that followed were confusing. Blake grew quiet. He still helped in the garden, but his eyes were distant. Hannah didn't pressure him, but she didn't hide her unease either. She knew he was facing something huge, and she also knew she couldn't decide for him. "I never wanted to keep you here," she said one night, "but I won't shrink myself to fit into the life of someone who doesn't know where he wants to be." Blake didn't respond. He just held her hand tightly, like someone afraid of losing what he loves just by thinking of leaving. The London offer became public. The media speculated. Blake Lancaster to return to international business, read one headline. And the Florist? Read another. Then came the attacks. Will she let him turn it down for her? Is she afraid of losing him, or afraid to leave his shadow? And just like that, cruelly, Hannah was reduced once again to a footnote in a powerful man's story. But this time, she didn't stay silent. In an open letter posted on the Living Roots project page, Hannah wrote, "The love I live is not a chain. It's a choice. And if needed, I will choose to love even from afar. But I will not be blamed for someone choosing not to be who they are. Because true love lets the other grow." The message went viral. Thousands applauded her maturity. But for Hannah, it was simply the truth. And deep down, it was also a silent goodbye. In case he chose to go, Blake read the letter in the foundation's office. He read it again and again. Then he walked alone through the garden trails for hours. He stopped in front of the wooden sign that read, "What grows in silence blooms stronger." He sat there and cried, because it wasn't just about staying or going. It was about who he was ready to be. The man chasing success to prove something, or the man choosing to stay, not out of fear, but out of love. For the first time, he wanted both worlds. But he knew one would cost too much. The next morning, a press conference was scheduled. Blake would step up and announce his decision. The city watched. International press waited. Hannah didn't go. She stayed in the shop, watering her plants as if trying to stop an earthquake with a plastic watering can. Deep down, she trusted, not the outcome, but him, because she loved that man, even if he chose to leave. The conference hall was packed. Blake stepped onto the stage in a light suit, his gaze steady. He thanked them for the opportunity, spoke about the offer, the challenges, the prestige, then took a deep breath. "But today, I choose to stay, not because I'm afraid to go, but because I've learned that not all success is about achievements. Some successes are quiet, like love that stands the test of time, like caring for a garden, like presence." He ended with, "I'm not rejecting the world. I'm choosing mine." The room went silent for a few seconds. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then rising, then unanimous. But Blake didn't hear them. His eyes were fixed on the memory of a garden, of a florist with dirt on her hands, and the truest gaze he'd ever seen. He walked off the stage without giving interviews, slipped out through a side door, heart pounding. For the first time, he felt he had made the right choice, not for the world, but for himself. Meanwhile, in the shop, Hannah continued her routine. She was watering the ferns on the back shelf when she heard the bell on the door. She wasn't expecting any customers. When she turned around, he was there. No suit, no prepared speech, just him, Blake, the whole man, the man who stayed. She dropped the watering can and took a deep breath. Her eyes filled with tears, but her body stood firm. "You chose?" she asked. He nodded. "I chose the ground where my roots make sense. And that ground is you." Hannah walked slowly toward him. The world outside could be celebrating, debating headlines and contracts. But inside that little flower shop, something greater was happening. Permanence. When she reached him, she touched his face with both hands. "Thank you for staying with truth." He smiled. "Thank you for not asking me to stay. If you had, maybe I would have gone. But because you let me go, I knew I had to come back." Then they embraced. And the embrace lasted longer than any answered in the days that followed. The community garden became the scene of spontaneous celebrations. Not because Blake turned down a position, but for something rarer, a man choosing the invisible. Children glued paper flowers to the walls. Volunteers wrote notes of gratitude. And in the center of the garden, a new tree was planted. On its trunk, a small wooden plaque read, "Some choices aren't about destiny. They're about courage." And everyone knew it was a symbol of something that would never be uprooted. Blake and Hannah returned to their routine with the lightness of those who had already faced the worst. Mornings began with warm bread and soft conversations. Afternoons with sun on their shoulders and dirt under their nails. Evenings with silences that no longer hurt, they simply embraced. He continued his work at the foundation, joining meetings, expanding social programs. But now, he moved at a different pace. One of listening, one of presence, one of a love that no longer needed to prove itself. Just remained. One night, sitting on the living room floor surrounded by photos, Hannah found the first picture they took together, at the back of the shop, her apron stained, and him stiff in a tailored suit. They laughed at the image. "We had no idea where we were stepping," she said. "But we were already starting to bloom," he replied. She framed the photo and hung it by the shop's entrance. Because some roots must be remembered, and that beginning, crooked, unexpected, real, was the seed of everything. One afternoon, while organizing materials for a new workshop, Blake knelt in front of Hannah, holding a small object in his hands. Her eyes widened in surprise, but he smiled calm. "It's not a proposal. Not yet. It's just a gift." It was a simple ring with a tiny carved flower, to remind us that, even when everything feels uncertain, we already have a whole garden inside us. Hannah took the ring carefully, silent tears in her eyes, and she said, "Then let's take care of it." Every day, behind the scenes, Blake's former allies tried to lure him back into the big business world. They offered titles, prestige, recognition. He declined, one offer at a time, always respectfully, but firmly, because now he knew who he was, and he knew no empire was worth more than the peace of walking among flowers he had planted himself. Hannah watched with pride, not because he had changed, but because he had returned to who he was before the world told him to be someone else. The Living Roots project grew. New branches opened in other towns. Young people were trained. Stories were shared. And at the center of it all were two people who once believed love wouldn't survive the pressure of the world. But they learned that true love isn't protected by walls, but by presence. And silence, when respected, becomes home. Because those who truly listen stay. Even when everything screams for them to leave. In the final scene of that chapter, they were walking hand in hand through the garden at sunset. Around them, children ran, flowers swayed in the breeze, and a new sign was placed at the entrance gate. It read, handwritten, "Welcome to the place where even silence blooms." Hannah looked at Blake and asked, "Did we win?" And he answered with a calm smile, "We chose." And that's already the greatest victory. And there, in the simplicity the world might never understand, their love kept growing. In peace, in truth, in roots. In the months that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Nothing extraordinary happened, and maybe that was the most beautiful part. Hannah woke up early, made tea, opened the shop, and greeted the neighbors with a smile. Blake, more and more at ease in the simple life, took on roles he never imagined. Fixing leaks, helping with project spreadsheets, even delivering flowers on rainy days. Sometimes they'd look at each other in silence and just know they were building something. Not with spotlights, but with roots. And no one could take that kind of foundation away. Their relationship was no longer made of uncertainties. It was built on calm conversations, shared decisions, a touch on the shoulder when passing by, a note left on the table. And even on days when they argued, because yes, they still did, the listening remained. Blake had learned not to run. Hannah had learned not to stay silent. And together, they had learned how to begin again, even in the smallest breaks. Love, now, wasn't idealized. It was lived, in chaos and in calm. One morning, a journalist appeared, trying to convince them to turn their story into a documentary. A billionaire who gives it all up for a humble florist. "That's gold," he said, excited. But Hannah kindly declined. "We're not characters. We're people. And our gold is in the soil we tend." Blake smiled in the background, proud. Not because she was defending him, but because she was still herself. Strong, whole, free. And that's why he loved her. And that's why he would choose her. Every single day. A new space was inaugurated inside Living Roots, the listening room. A place for anyone who just wanted to speak, or simply be heard. No judgment, no rush. Hannah spent a few hours there each week, listening to stories that hurt, that healed, that left marks. Blake sometimes sat there too, not to listen, but to be heard, because even the strongest need a soft place to land. And there, in that room, they always remembered why they started all of it. On a special night, the garden was lit with lanterns handmade by the children in the project. The benches were covered in cozy blankets, and the walls were decorated with quotes from participants. One stood out: "Love is when someone stays, even when leaving would be easier." Blake read it and gently touched Hannah's hand. She smiled and whispered, "You stayed." And he replied, eyes gleaming, "Because I found my home." In the weeks that followed, the community around the shop continued to grow. Couples rediscovered how to talk to each other. Teenagers went back to school, elderly folks volunteered to teach gardening. It was more than a project. It was a refuge. And at its center was that couple the world once tried to dismiss. Now, no one called them the billionaire and the florist. They were simply Blake and Hannah, a man and a woman who learned that the greatest act of love is to stand whole beside someone who doesn't need to complete you, only walk with you. Blake began writing a book, not about business, but about listening, about rebuilding, about everything he learned when he had the courage to unlearn. Hannah helped him organize the chapters, not to edit them, but to remember, because memory is the soil of permanence, and every love that doesn't want to be forgotten needs to be written down, not for the world, but for themselves, to remember, on the hard days, everything they had already overcome. One afternoon, Hannah found Blake in the garden, quietly watching a group of teens water the plants. She sat beside him and asked, "What are you thinking about?" He replied, "How easy it would have been not to be here. If I had said yes back then." She rested her head on his shoulder. "And how empty you would have felt if you'd said yes to something that erased your soul." He nodded, and in that silence, another seed was planted. The certainty that, despite all the losses, they had gained what mattered most. The flower shop had become a symbol of something greater. Not just beauty, but resilience, daily love, stories that didn't need to be grand to be true. Visitors came from far away, not to see a famous couple, but to find a place that still believed the simple could be eternal. And Hannah, with her stained apron and calm smile, welcomed each one as if they were part of it. Because there, in that soil, she knew exactly who she was. And she knew that was exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, as they closed the shop together, Blake took her hand and asked, "Do you still get scared of what we've built?" Hannah smiled. "Every single day, but I've never thought about running." He looked her in the eyes. "And I will never again let the world confuse us." She leaned her forehead to his. "Then we keep going, one pot at a time, one choice a day, because in the end, that's what love is. Not what begins with promises, but what continues with presence." Autumn arrived quietly, covering the garden in golden tones and leaves dancing with the wind. Hannah swept the shop entrance as she did every year, but this time, something felt different. It wasn't just another season. It was the first time. She felt she didn't have to brace for loss. For the first time, her love wasn't fleeting. It was presence. And there, among dried flowers and strong roots, she understood. True love isn't what shows up, it's what stays. That morning, Blake was preparing something special. He told no one, not even Hannah. He gathered kids, teens, and volunteers in the garden and asked for help setting up a surprise. He didn't want to impress, only to remind. Their story deserved to be celebrated, not with luxury, but with meaning. Every gesture was a way to thank the woman who taught him to plant. With patience, because lasting love is cultivated with time. Meanwhile, Hannah worked behind the scenes on the new educational greenhouse. It was a long-held dream, imagined in the earliest days of Living Roots. A space to teach about listening, self-care, and affection through soil. She organized seeds, labels, small benches, and colorful panels. She didn't know that, as she worked, someone was watching her tenderly from a distance. Blake, hidden behind the plants, smiled in silence. That's when he loved her most. In her quiet devotion, with no audience, no effort, just being. That Saturday afternoon, one of the teens called her. "Someone's waiting for you in the back garden." She found it odd but followed the dirt path with steady steps. When she turned the greenhouse corner, the space was transformed. Lanterns hung from branches, white cloth swayed in the breeze, and a path of dried flowers led to a small stage. At the center, Blake stood, eyes full of tears and a soft smile. She stopped, surprised, moved, not understanding that he reached out. His hand. She walked toward him. There was no crowd, no press, no shiny rings. Just a group of people who had watched them bloom. Children held handmade signs. "You stayed. You taught us to love. This is home." And there was Blake, voice quiet but steady, saying, "This isn't a proposal. It's just a promise. To keep being here. To keep caring. To keep choosing you. Every day, even when it's hard. Because love no longer needs to be proven. Just lived." Hannah smiled through teary eyes. She touched his face and replied, "And I promise to keep being me. With dirt on my hands, with good days and bad, with silences and laughter. I promise not to shrink you. I promise to grow beside you." There were no rings, just an embrace. And when their arms found each other, everyone around clapped. But the strongest sound wasn't applause. It came from the hearts of those who recognized. Real love is quiet, constant, and brave. After the embrace, they sat at the center of the makeshift stage. Someone brought tea. A child handed them a gift wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a handmade journal with photos, notes, drawings, and words. It was their story, told by those who had witnessed it. Hannah turned the pages slowly. Blake smiled, taking in each memory. And there, surrounded by people they loved, walls they had built, flowers they had nurtured, they realized their story wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone who had learned to stay. That evening, after the gathering, the shop was quiet. Hannah lit candles throughout the house while Blake made a simple soup. They sat at the old wooden table, the sounds of the street drifting gently through the cracked window. Neither said much, but their exchanged glances said everything. And when Hannah took his hand over the table, she whispered, "Thank you for never asking me to be less." Blake replied, "Thank you for showing me I could be more, without losing who I am." At the end of that night, they sat on the porch, blankets on their legs, warm mugs in their hands. They watched the sky without rush. Hannah leaned her head on his shoulder. "If someone writes our story someday, what do you think they'll remember?" Blake looked up at the stars and answered, "That we were simple, but we chose each other, even when giving up would have been easier." And at that moment, they both smiled, because they knew love wasn't an event. It was a verb, a care, a home to in the days that followed. The garden bloomed with new flowers, spontaneous ones, from seeds brought by visitors. Each had a story: a grandmother who saw her grandson again, a woman who dared to start over, a young man who apologized to his father. Hannah walked through the flower beds as if walking through the living pages of a book she hadn't even realized she was writing. Blake walked beside her, listening to stories, giving space, watering with care. And so, their story became no longer about two, but about many. The shop now had a new window display. It no longer sold just flowers. It sold meaning. A shelf held handwritten cards, books about listening, and small growing kits. People came in just to talk, and left with something you can't carry in a bag: comfort. Hannah often said that shop didn't sell flowers. It sold permanence. Because that's what she and Blake had built. A place where even pain had somewhere to belong. On a cold morning, Blake woke before the sun. He made her favorite tea and left a simple note on the table: "See you in the garden." Like always. When Hannah woke and read it, she smiled. Outside, she saw him sitting on the same bench where they had once sat that first autumn. He waited, eyes closed, face lifted to the sky. As she approached, he simply held out his hand. And she knew, not every day needs something new. Some just need consistency. The garden was fuller than ever, but they still found each other amid the noise. It was like they had learned a frequency of their own. Hannah lost herself in the details of the plants, Blake in the gestures she made. When the day's work was done, they'd sit on the ground, side by side, among pots and roots. They didn't make grand plans, just jotted down ideas. And sometimes, not even that. They just sat there. Because true love also knows how to be still. A group of children began writing letters for the future of the garden. One said, "When I grow up, I want to be like the woman who didn't give up, even when they said she wasn't enough." Hannah read it and cried. Blake too, because they knew what every choice had cost. And now, they also knew they had left behind more than flowers. They had left a path, a living memory, a place where love no longer needed approval, just room to grow. One afternoon, as the sun turned the fallen leaves to gold, Hannah looked at Blake and asked, "Do you think we'll grow old here?" He held her hand and answered firmly, "I think we already have." She laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder. And that's how they understood. Permanence doesn't begin with eternal promises. It begins with today, with now, with each small decision to stay, even when everything screams to leave. That a new mural was painted on the garden side wall. It read, "Where there is root, there can be a new beginning." It was Blake's idea. Hannah chose the colors. All the volunteers helped. It was more than a phrase. It was the invisible legacy of the two of them. A daily reminder that pain can be soil, and love, the seed. That presence heals. And that silence, when truly heard, becomes a language between souls. That's where they left a piece of their hearts. On the foundation's anniversary, there was no party, just a circle of conversation, hot tea, and a fire pit. People shared their stories. They laughed. They cried. They gave thanks. An 83-year-old woman held Hannah's hand and said, "I never thought a florist and an heir would make me believe again." Hannah simply smiled. And Blake, beside her, squeezed her hand. Because there, under the open sky, warmed by the fire, they understood their love had become shelter. And that was everything. On the last night of the season, it was just the two of them in the garden, now silent. The world outside spun fast, but in there, everything breathed slowly. Hannah rested her head on Blake's chest and whispered, "I think we did it." He smiled into her hair and replied, "We stayed." And that was enough. Because stories that leave a mark aren't made of grand beginnings, but of small acts that endure. Every single day. If this story touched your heart, like, share, and comment on the part that moved you the most. Tag someone who still believes in love that stays. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, ones that don't shout, but remain. Here, every flower has a story, and every silence, a root. Asterisk until the next story. And remember, true love knows how to stay.